I lead the interview skills coaching practice for MyCareerBrand, and I've been working with MyCareerBrand doing this for about 5 years. Prior to that, I spent about 15 years working in recruitment, so I've got a lot of experience working with hiring managers to deliver some successful outcomes. So just before we get into the main presentation for today, just a little bit of housekeeping. We've got in excess of 100 people registered for this webinar today, so if you could please turn off your cameras and mute your microphones, that will just help us to minimise potential for technology issues. We are recording this session, so if you do have technical issues, don't worry, we'll distribute the recording at the end of the session. And if you've got any questions, obviously you've got your microphones on mute, but do feel free to ask questions as we go, just using the chat box. We've got some time at the end for questions, so I'll just wait till the end of the presentation and then come back to questions. Okay, so when I was pulling this presentation together, I thought it would be useful to just talk about, why we interview and the purpose of conducting interviews, and then take you through, I suppose, in terms of sort of timing of interviews, the various stages that you need to be going through and the points that you need to consider at certain times. So first of all, why do we interview and what are some of the candidate expectations? So in advance of this session, we actually conducted a survey of all of our clients at MyCareerBrand, and there's some data in that survey at the bottom. But essentially, an interview is not an interrogation. So what is it? The interview is an opportunity for you to understand the motivations, the skills, and the overall fit of the individual that you're assessing for the organisation, and also for them to find out about you. So it's very much a two-way conversation, and it's important that you're engaging because they're evaluating you as well. In terms of the types of interviews, there's a range of different interviews that you can conduct. It can be a one-on-one, a single person interview. You might decide that a panel interview is more appropriate. You might want to bring the applicant in to meet the team. So just think about the format for the interviews that you want to conduct. And what are some of the candidate expectations? So I mentioned a moment ago the survey that we had conducted. The data from this survey is at the end of the slide deck, which we'll come to at the end, and you'll be given these slides to take away. But I just wanted to share with you 3 points that I thought were really interesting around what candidate expectations are. So the top 3 are to gain an insight into the team, the culture and the organisation, to gain clarity on the role, and lastly to gain feedback. So all of our clients that were surveyed ranked this at 4 out of 5, so something that was really important to them. Craig, have you got anything that you want to add at the end of that slide before we move on? You're on mute.
The constant thing for lockdown, you're on mute. Yeah, I think it's really important that we pay attention to particularly those 3, but there's others too, as you say, Kaela, that you'll be sharing. But I think a lot of what hiring managers, in my experience, don't necessarily consider is both the brand damage to themselves and to the organisation when A, they don't provide any feedback, or B, the feedback that they do provide is not constructive, or C, it's not done in a timely fashion. So there's, even when candidates don't or aren't successful, there's really good ways of managing that process through rock solid feedback.
Thank you. Okay, moving on to the next slide. So these are the things that you need to think about before you actually sit down and interview someone. So the first thing I do, and when I'm working with clients, this is the first thing that we do, is sit down and evaluate the role and really think about what are the deliverables that this person is going to have to meet in this position, and what are the required skills that they need to have to enable them to meet those. If this is a replacement role, just consider whether the scope of the role has changed since the last time you you hired this position. You know, what you needed in your business previously might be very different to what you need moving forward. So now's the time to really establish that. Then think about your hiring process. So before you start inviting people in for interviews, be really clear on what your full hiring process looks like. Are you going to use psychometric assessment? When in the process are you going to use that? Just be clear on what the entire process looks like from end to end. The next thing to consider is thinking about an interview format, and also thinking about creating interview templates for each stage of the interview. You might have people coming back a number of different times, so create templates for each interview that you have the individuals attending interviews for, and think about including weighted scorecards. Often some of the skills that are required might be more important than others, so make sure that you've thought about that in your weighting for your scoring of the interview. The process needs to be consistent as well. I was working with a client last year who was requiring some support around assessment, and I sat down with the hiring manager, and he'd come with 50 questions that he wanted to ask each of the people that he was taking through his process, which is it's not going to be time efficient, and it's also really setting you up for running an inconsistent process, which then leaves you wide open to claims of unfair treatment and bias. So you really want to make sure that that process is fair and is equitable. Next stage, brief your recruiter. Talk to the recruiters that you're working with and seek input from them on the process that you're running. They are absolutely the experts when it comes to recruitment, so you know their feedback could be really valuable to your process. And something else that I've seen done really well, and that gives really positive messaging about your employer brand, is if you can provide a branded interview preparation package for all of your candidates, just outlining to them what the process looks like, what the format for each of the interviews will be, and just some suggestions around how they can prepare. A one-page document with your key brand on it, that has real positive impact on a candidate's impression. Then schedule some time for your interviews. Block a day out of your diary if you can. Best practice is absolutely to conduct all of your first round, all of your second round interviews on the same day, so that your thinking is fresh around each of the individuals that you're assessing. And when you're scheduling that time, just make sure that you're scheduling an extra 15 minutes for calibration post-interview, which is where you get your heads together and make some sense of your notes. And lastly, schedule time for feedback for all of your interviewees. Craig, have you got anything you'd like to add before we move on?
Yeah, just on the calibration, I think that's really important to run through, what your views were during the interview, and just check in, on those key points, on the answers and so on. And perhaps if it's appropriate, then that person can always challenge you, on your thinking and raise things that you may not have thought before.
Cool, thank you. Okay, so just delving a little bit further into some consistency. Think about your key questions and prepare these key questions in advance. I mentioned a moment ago my client with his 50 questions. You want to be going into the interview with probably 4 to 6 key questions that you're going to ask of every applicant, just so that you can demonstrate that consistency. So know and agree the importance and the weighting of each of those answers. Ensure the candidate has got a range of different examples. What I find, or used to find quite often when I was interviewing people, and I still find it now when I'm doing interview skills training, is that people can use one example that will apply to a range of different competencies. And whilst they might have this brilliant example that does cover all different range of competencies, it's not demonstrating a breadth of experience when you get into the interview. So just encouraging people to maybe delve back a little bit further, just so you can get a really good understanding of the breadth of their experience rather than one particular scenario. Have they demonstrated continuous improvement or continuous evolution? And what I mean by this is, if a candidate can demonstrate that they've learnt from earlier experience and applied those learnings to subsequent scenarios that they've been interested in, that they've been engaged in to deliver business benefit, then that's really positive, and that, you know, really is really a great demonstration of their ability to learn. Discuss the results with all relevant stakeholders. I should probably use this with a bit of caution, because we don't want 15 people trying to make a decision on one person, because that just will has the potential to become a disaster. But are there people in the organisation that need to buy into this person before they're hired? And, you know, will it make their job much easier if they have had the opportunity to have that buy-in? And lastly, L&D opportunities. So when you're assessing fit for a position, there's kind of 3 different aspects that you want to consider. There's the know-how, which is their technical skills and their competencies that they've built and developed through their learning. There's the can-do, which is their kind of behavioural attributes. And then there's the want-to, which is their desire and their drive or their motivational fit. Research shows that somebody who has got a really strong motivational fit, plus the right behavioural attributes, but maybe some gaps on the technical side, is going to be a much better hire for you in the long term. So always consider, you know, if there are technical gaps, are there L&D opportunities that we could put this person on that will allow them to grow into the position? Craig, do you want to add anything before we move on?
Yeah, I just thinking about the broader strategy of the business that you're working within too. You know, thinking about, would this person actually be, you know, worthwhile, or could they work in another area of the business? Might not be quite right for you just now, but just make sure that they're, you know, you're looking out for the other parts of the business too. Yeah.
Is there an opportunity for this person to be a great hire in a different area of your business?
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, so moving on to during the interview. So you've got them in, you're sitting down with them. We touched at the beginning on the fact that this, you know, the interview is a two-way street. So they're evaluating you as much as you're evaluating them. We would expect an interviewee to come in with their phone switched off, with notifications switched off on their phone, on their watch. Sorry, if they're wearing a smartwatch. So hold yourselves to that same standard, you know, and keep your phone turned off and be aware of your own body language. Be engaging, because you're being assessed as much as they are. During the interview, listen to evaluate. Listen to understand is what that should say there. Take notes. I would not attempt to score somebody or to evaluate somebody's points while you're listening to them talk. I've done this myself, and you end up just missing points of detail and struggling to catch up with the story. So when you're in the interview, I would sit there and make notes, just so that when it comes to calibration, you can recap those answers, and that's when you score. The other thing to consider is both verbal and non-verbal communication. So 70 to 80% of communication is non-verbal. So be really aware of things like body language, tone, pitch, gestures, eye contact. You know, they're all important indicators of what that person is trying to say as well. Time management. I think we've all sat in interviews where somebody's just gone off on a tangent and talked and talked and talked. And it's, you know, it's not great for the candidate and it's not great for you. What I have learned is that if I'm asking somebody a question, I'll actually tell them, I want you to spend 2 to 3 minutes giving me an answer on this. And it really helps people to stay on track and to know how much detail they need to give for each answer that they're giving. Stick to your template. And also to the plan of who's asking which question, if there are a number of you in the interview. Candidate questions. We tell our candidates when we're preparing them for interviews to make sure they come to the meeting with questions. You can actually get a really good insight into how motivated this person is by listening to the questions that they ask you and making a note of them. So make sure, first of all, that you save time for those questions. And secondly, make a note of them, because they can be quite helpful for you when you're scoring that person at the end. And then lastly, explain the next steps, commit to feedback, and thank them for their time. Anything to add, Craig, before we move on?
No, move on. It's great.
Okay. So lastly, after the interview, immediately after the interview, sit down and run through your notes. If you're interviewing on your own, then I would, at that point, I would score the person's answers. If you're interviewing with a panel, get your heads together and work out the scoring between the three of you, or however many of you there are on the panel. What is really powerful for candidates is if you can tell them three things that they did really well and an area for improvement. If you can come back to them with that in feedback, then that is really, really powerful stuff. And if you do it immediately after the interview, it will probably take you about 5 minutes. So that's your calibration. And then the next point is feedback. So once you've made those points about what they did well and what to improve, feed that back to your recruiter. What this does is it cements the buy-in that you've created during the interview. And it also actually makes your life really easy for when you've reached the end of the process and you need to offer the position to one person and redirect the rest. If you've already come back to them with feedback, you don't need to worry about doing that again. Candidates spend hours preparing, so to hear nothing is really disheartening, and it's really damaging to your employer brand and undoes all that great work that you did during the interview. You got anything to add there, Craig?
Yeah, I think it's just really important for internal candidates as well to make sure that you manage that process, because you don't want to lose them from the business. I think I think the fact that they're actually applying for a job, a different role within the organisation, actually flags the fact that they're looking. Yeah. So just be aware of that and make sure that you're following up with that in terms of what their career development opportunities might be as well.
Perfect. Okay, so I'm not really going to talk to this slide very much, but this is the data that we will share with you all from the survey that we conducted, and this went out to over 500 people, so it was quite a high pool. Okay, so now I'm going to hand you over to Nikki and Kirsty to give a market update.
Okay, thank you. So I think everyone is fairly well aware that New Zealand is currently experiencing a very candidate short market, which essentially means there are fewer job seekers than there are available positions. The latest data out from Seek this month indicates that national job ads for February this year were 40% higher than February last year and 31% higher than February 2019. On top of that, we've got applications per job ads fell by 9% month on month, and it's down 36% as of January this year versus January 2 years ago. So we've got a candidate short market. It's been driven by multiple factors. We've got low unemployment, which is sitting at just 3.2%. We've got closed borders. We've got government pay freezes, which are creating churn, particularly in Wellington, where candidates are changing jobs in order to get pay rises. And there's the talk of the Great Resignation. Whilst largely out of America so far, new research does suggest that more than 2 in 5 New Zealand workers are planning to look for a new job, which is a sign that the Great Resignation could hit New Zealand shores in coming years. So I suppose as a result of this market, we're starting to see upward pressure on salaries. And I think that's only going to continue with the rising cost of living, and many industries struggling to recruit are having to adjust their salaries in order to attract talent. And you know, while the reopening of international borders may be a cause for some optimism in terms of an influx of workers again for the first time in 2 years potentially, there is concern that we're going to lose candidates to the great OE overseas. In fact, ANZ economists are predicting as many as 20,000 people per year are going to be leaving New Zealand just for Australia alone. So I think the key message at the moment is to do everything you can to retain your good talent. But you know, despite best efforts, we know that people are going to leave. So Kirsty's going to talk through a little bit about what you can do in order to recruit and retain talent in this candidate short market.
Yeah, thank you. So obviously we've talked about using an interview as an opportunity to sell the role and your organisation and to really understand candidates' motivation. But things to consider when recruiting in this candidate short market: decrease your time to hire. You need to move your process forward as soon as applications close date comes, or sooner if you identify a really outstanding candidate. Taking too long can really risk losing applicants to other opportunities that they're considering, and they certainly will be considering other opportunities in this market. Pay market rates. We've talked about evaluating the position. That's really important to do prior to going to market, but equally don't be afraid to have frank conversations with your candidates in regards to their remuneration expectations so that there are no surprises. As it is a candidates market, they know that their skills are in hot demand and they're likely to negotiate accordingly. Consider what other benefits you might be able to offer. You might not be able to offer top dollar or compete with other organisations. So think about other things that you can offer in addition to that monetary components, such as additional leave or flexibility that in this market might be working from home, could be different hours. You could offer a car park or something along those lines, and get really clear on communicating that to candidates in your advertising. They really want to know what's in it for them as well. As I've said, they will be actively looking, likely, so don't be afraid to ask where candidates are at in regards to other opportunities they're considering. That way you'll know what you're up against and whether you're at risk of losing them to another employer, so that you can keep things moving and jump before they get another opportunity. We're seeing in this market lots of candidates receiving multiple offers, and more often than not counter offers as well. So knowing where they're at with those can help you move things along. Always be recruiting. We've talked about that. If you interview someone for one role that they're not quite right for, think more broadly and sort of continually recruit for a pipeline of talent. So you're building a talent community to engage with, and you're not starting from scratch again when you do have another role. And lastly, consider headhunting, or that candidate search activity. Due to the low number of applicants across the board at the moment, many recruiters and hiring managers are doing more extensive search, more headhunting activity to find and approach people that might not necessarily be looking for a role. Seek recently reported that up to 74% of Kiwis could be interested in a new opportunity, but less than half of those are actively looking. So they're not going to see your ad on Seek or Do Good Jobs or wherever you may be putting it. They're happy where they are and won't know they're looking to move until you serve that role up in front of them. So it's about getting to those passive candidates. And yeah, that's where we can help if needs be.
I think on that, oh, sorry, go on, Craig.
I think that whole talent mapping piece, Kirsty and Nikki, is really important, isn't it? And starting the conversations early. So thinking where you want to be strategically, and thinking about, you know, engaging people to talent map for you, and start the conversations with the people externally if you're not able to move internally.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just going to make a point on the headhunting as well. I've done a lot of headhunting in my recruitment career, and your employer brand is so important. When, you know, if you're trying to tap people on the shoulder, you really want to be thinking about what your employer brand is like, because those proactive approaches are just going to fall flat on their faces if your employer brand is weak. So yeah, coming back to the feedback and the importance of kind of behaving in a way that respects your employer brand during the hiring process. Okay, we are here to help. So obviously the session today has been organised by McLaren, and MyCareerBrand are here to help as well. So following on from the session today, we'll send you out an email with a special offer for some interview skills coaching, if that was something that you were interested in taking up. A copy of the interview template that we've talked you through today, a link to today's recording, and also my contact details if you wanted to have a chat about hiring in your own team. And Craig, before we hand over to questions, have you got anything that you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I think it doesn't hurt to, before you go on to your next interview, if you're looking at that interview template that we're going to send through, think about how it might work with your organisation as well, with your existing, recruitment practices, and map it into that. And if you want to tap into Kaela's knowledge around that, that's really important too, to get sort of an unbiased, if you like, view and some different thinking, around what your interviewing might be like. But also, don't forget, the recruiter too. So I think, working with them. But yeah, we look forward to engaging with you more as we progress. Okay.
Questions? So we had some questions come through on the chat box, which for some reason I can't find.
Kirsty and Nikki, I think you have them.
Yeah, we can access those. So one is, what mechanisms can unsuccessful candidates use to challenge the outcome of an interview?
Do you want to tackle that one, Craig?
You want me to tackle it?
Yeah.
Okay, so what that one was dealing with is that they were dissatisfied with where they came in the process and what mechanisms. Well, I think their first port of call would be, to have a conversation with HR or the hiring manager. And I think that's, you want to make sure that you've actually got professional advice before you start engaging in that. So be very careful about where you go as a hiring manager on this. Because depending on what your answers are, and this comes right back to Nikki and Kirsty's feedback and Kaela's comments as well around about feedback throughout the process, and making sure that you keep really robust notes throughout, so that you can demonstrate that, afterwards. And I was involved with a selection process for a very large government organisation, and they did have some internal disputes with that in terms of the process, and it was fortunate that there was some really good, robust record keeping. So that can be, their mechanisms could be go to HR, they can challenge it, they may even want to have a conversation with the hiring manager. As I say, if it's with the hiring manager should make sure that they get advice first, because hiring managers, their main job is not hiring, and they're certainly not ER specialists or employment law specialists either. So just make sure. You might be surprised also. So there was a case a while ago where a person who was external to the organisation actually lodged an employment court case because they thought they'd been discriminated by age. As it was, they didn't win that case, but it really again highlighted the fact that the hiring manager or the interviewers needed to have robust decision mapping and process in place and recorded.
Next question is regarding the market update stats. Can you repeat the source of the numbers provided?
Yeah, absolutely. A variety of sources. Seek, that was in relation to the job ads and the applications per job ads numbers. The unemployment levels is from statistics, and also I did quote ANZ in terms of their economist prediction around the number of people leaving New Zealand for Australia in the coming year. So variety. Yeah.
How accurate are references? Some people might just want to get rid of an employee, pass the problem on. How can you guard against this?
Reference checking is the last stage of the process. What I would suggest that you do is have a robust hiring process so that when you get to the end of the process, you do know that person quite well. Ideally, you want to conduct 2 reference checks, ideally with people who have led that person or been their direct manager, their most recent last 2 managers. Sometimes that's not always possible, and often it depends on the nature of the role that the person's coming into. Sometimes somebody who hasn't necessarily led them but who's worked really closely with them on a piece of work can be a really good referee. I think there is always an element of risk when it comes to references, but I think running the person through a really robust selection process, and secondly, when you take your references, take them verbally and make them detailed. The reference checking that I did when I was working in recruitment, each reference check would take about half an hour because we would really delve into a lot of detail around that person's competencies and capabilities and their experience. So you felt like you got a really good sense of what that person had done and the value that they added to the organisation that they've worked in by the time you got off the call. If you're sending out a quick email with a couple of tick box templates, then that's not going to give you the confidence necessarily that a detailed verbal reference check would do. You got anything else you want to add to that, guys?
I mean, I suppose you're only going to have that potential risk of somebody wanting to move a existing employee on by saying good things about them for their current boss. So I suppose that again highlights the need to be doing at least 2 references. So should you get that situation, if you're then also speaking with their most immediate past manager and you've got two quite conflicting reference statements, then obviously you're going to do some more background checking. So yeah, I suppose it's the importance of having a variety of really strong references.
Yeah, I think it's really important, this aspect of it. And Kaela, you mentioned the stage of reference checking. I have seen reference checks done at a midpoint as well, so that they can use those to further calibrate the candidate. But I've also seen in really good reference checking, delving into the environment that person's been working in, because many a time a candidate will move from a different environment into an environment into a new environment, and that environment is not necessarily going to set them up for success the same way as their previous environment has. So make sure that you understand, the way that the candidates work best as well. It might not, the fact that you've made a hire, and you've done all the reference checking doesn't necessarily guarantee success in the role. So the hiring manager, to your point, the questioner around the person might be just wanting to get rid of them. That's not necessarily always the case. It could be the case, but I think they could be performing really, really well in their current role because of the environment and the support that they're given to.
A follow-up question to that, how useful are informal chats over coffee or trial by cheese and wine?
I think it depends on the role, and I think it depends on the environment. I think the other thing you've got to consider is this trial by cheese and wine going to drag out your process and add another week to your hiring process, in which case that person might have another offer and you might lose a really great candidate in waiting for this to happen. The other thing to consider is, who are they meeting at this cheese and wine function? Sounds like a great idea in practice, but who are they meeting? Who are they meeting, and what part in the decision-making process do those other attendees at the meeting have? Are you setting yourself up for a bit of a nightmare by inviting too many people to contribute? That being said, in some instances, it can be a really good way to measure cultural fit. So I think it really depends on the nature of the role that the person's coming into and how appropriate it is for that process. What would your thoughts be, guys?
Yeah, I suppose agree that they are really good for assessing organisational fit. You've got to be mindful, I suppose, as to whether every other potential applicant on that shortlist is also having the coffee meeting or the informal meeting, and I guess the degree of consistency between those coffee meetings, because yeah, I guess there's that potential for somebody that you really gel with to be blinded by that and not considering the full set of skills and experience that they might bring to the job, which actually might make them a better performer in the role. But there's somebody who's quite similar to you who you happen to really gel with, and you might be led to go down that path potentially, which might not be the best outcome. So yeah.
Yeah, there was some research that I read, or an article that I read by McKinsey a while back, and they said for change to happen, culture has to change first. So if you're bringing somebody in and that person is part of the new culture or represents the new culture that you're bringing in, just remember that, or think about how are they going to meld when they go through that team meeting process, and how are the team going to feel about that? Because it's likely that actually the team, if you're saying, look, subject to you getting on well with the team, or the team actually thinking you're okay, yeah, we'll move forward. The reality is, if you're trying to introduce change or a new culture into the organisation, just be aware of the impact of that and what that might actually have when you're doing a team meeting scenario. It's likely that that team, if they're a very different culture, might reject that person because of the change that they perceive might happen.
Thank you. A couple more questions. How long should you keep your interview notes?
I think best the HR practitioners will probably know the answer to this more than me, but I thought it was 7 years these things need to be stored for. So it's actually a really long time.
Yeah, that's the length of time we store our notes too.
Yeah.
Great. What is the place of psychometric assessment?
Psychometric assessment. So it depends on the type of psychometric assessment that you're using. There are a range of different types of psych assessment that measure various different things. I think it depends on the position that you are bringing them in to do. There are assessments that measure your cognitive ability, so how quickly you'll grasp new materials and new concepts. But that might be more important in certain roles than others. There are other assessments that measure your workplace preferences, and what you like and what your interests are, and how you're going to respond in certain environments. I've seen psych assessment used in a range of different ways. I think best practice is to have it early on in the process. If it's used between first and second interview, then psych assessment can give some really rich material for the interviewer to delve down into when it comes to the second interview. And from that perspective, I think they can be used really, really well to support a hiring process. Sometimes they're used at an end of a hiring process, and I kind of don't really see the point of that. I think used to support a hiring process feels much better to me. And redirecting people or saying no to people on the basis of psych is an absolute no-no. So my thinking would be to get it in the process at an early stage if you're going to use it. Anything to add on that, Craig, Kirsty, or Nikki?
How useful is getting candidates to do a presentation?
Do you want to take that one, Craig?
Really interesting one, and it's caught some candidates out, but it's also gone and rubbed some candidates up the wrong way. And the reason for that is because there's quite a bit of IP that they share, intellectual property of their own, that they share in a presentation. and then they see if they're unsuccessful, then the organisation walking away with that intellectual property. So be very careful how you frame it. I think it is useful for certain roles. So for example, if you were hiring somebody in sales who was going to be making a lot of presentations, to prospective clients and so on, you would absolutely want to get a handle on how they present. And you'd probably want to have that professionally measured as well. And that probably would be a panel presentation. So I think just talk it through and think about what your objectives are, what you're actually wanting them to be able to share and demonstrate. But yeah, I think, the lawyer's answer or the politician's answer is it depends.
I think the other thing to consider as well is that there is what presentations can be valuable, but they are a part of the process. So I wouldn't look at the performance in a presentation as your sole reason to count somebody in or count somebody out. I think the other important thing to consider is the fact that some people can get really rattled by being required to do something like that in an interview environment, whereas in real life they might not. So if somebody's performed really well across all the other points of assessment, then a poor presentation might not be a valid reason for them not to be the successful applicant. They might just need a little bit more support in that regard. But when you're looking at the entire hiring process, you want to be looking at all the various different points of assessment that you've made and making your judgment on the successful candidates on all of those points of assessment rather than just one thing.
Okay, thank you. Going back to the interview notes, someone has asked the retention of interview notes for 7 years, would this be for all candidates or just the successful one? That would be for all candidates. All evaluative material on all candidates needs to be held for 7 years. Is my understanding?
Yeah.
Okay. Someone has said, I have interviewed a few candidates over time, and on a couple of occasions I was told that the candidates' accents may impact on how they engage in the role. How should we provide this feedback to those candidates so it still keeps them motivated in their other job applications?
Oh, it is a really difficult one. I think it really depends on what the person is going to be doing. If they're coming into a role where they are going to be required to communicate with people and they can't be understood, then it's very tricky to see how that person could be a potential fit. I think what I would encourage you to do is think about, coming back to the feedback thing and your calibration, is to think about 3 things that person did well, and one thing that is a development area. So you're coming back to them with some positive elements for them, but maybe saying to them, at times the interviewer found you quite challenging to understand. So for future interviews, really think about your diction and think about slowing down how you speak and really clearly enunciating every word that you say. I think, particularly when you're in an interview situation and nerves are high, sometimes if English is not your first language and you're finding that environment a bit challenging, then it can be really hard for people. But you have to give that feedback, because otherwise they're not going to improve. But I think it's important to just make sure that you're giving some positive feedback as well as a development area. What are your thoughts, Craig, Nikki, and Kirsty?
Yeah, I agree. Being honest but constructive and respectful in the way you give that feedback is the key.
Yeah.
Okay. With the market as competitive as it is, would you recommend removing barriers such as testing and long interview processes? You touched on this briefly earlier.
I definitely recommend tightening up your processes as much as you can. I think, and I see Kirsty and Nikki nodding away there. Yeah, long, lengthy processes. When I first started working in internal recruitment, we had a process whereby there were probably 6 or 7 stages, and it used to kill me because I would just lose people through the process. And you see these great candidates just being offered positions with competitor organisations, and you just have to wave goodbye to them. So think about what is really necessary for your evaluation of this role, of the best person for this role, and tighten it up as much as you can. It comes down to your planning at the start as well. You know, if you at the point where you realise that you've got to hire, block the time out of your diary so that when you're shortlisted to, you don't look at your diary and go, oh, I've got no gaps for 2 weeks and it's going to take me 3 weeks to interview people. That happens all the time. But if you block out that time and are really disciplined about keeping that time free, then that really helps to keep things tight.
Yeah.
You got anything you'd add?
No, I think just shorten it as much as you can without compromising the quality of the process to ensure that you do a robust process.
Yeah.
Is it good practice to have an external independent person on the interview panel?
I have been an external independent person on numerous interview panels. And I think it's not essential, but I think it certainly brings some it brings that independent perspective, and it really makes sure, particularly in situations where you might be assessing for change, or if there's a process that's likely to be contentious, it kind of gives the hiring manager the support that there's somebody independent there who can say the process was fair, the process was consistent, the person with the best skills who was the best fit got the position, and here's the validation as to why. So, you know, it's not essential, but I think it definitely helps.
Does the issue of IP, I think that's talking back to about the presentation, matter in the examples you provide when you share your experiences in an interview?
Could you read that question again? It's just, does it matter? Is this on the candidate side, I'm assuming, what their IP is, or?
Yes, so when you're providing examples of your experience in an interview, does the issue of IP matter in those examples you provide?
Yeah, I think it's the IP. I think you need to think about where that IP has come from. And it's not just intellectual property, it's confidentiality as well. So if you're sharing IP or content that may be from your current employer or a previous employer, that is absolutely a no-no. What you need to think about as a candidate, and think about this as an employer as well, if that candidate in front of you is sharing IP from their current employer, what are they likely to do for you? Doesn't look great. So this is also a test for, you know, their integrity. And they might share examples, but as long as they don't share where they've come from, and make sure that it's not readily identifiable. So I think it's a fairly big question, but I think it's a really important one to measure on multiple fronts.
In regards to the makeup of an interview panel, if you have 3 on the panel, what is the recommended representation?
I think it really depends on who the role will be engaging with. So I don't think there's one answer for that. I think it depends on who are the stakeholders within your business that need to play a part in the hiring decision for this person. You know, often there's a representative from HR there who brings some objectivity and some people perspective. But and then obviously the hiring manager, as to who the third person could be, if you were having a third person, it really depends on what your business, what the functionality of the role is and who they'll be engaging with.
And I think it is a good idea to consider having 3 on a panel. Reason being, I recently had a client who had 2 members on the panel. They couldn't agree on who to select, and the process fell over, and they had to go back to market, thereby losing a number of months in regards to getting someone on board. So yeah, I think 3 is good practice.
There's an interesting thing in governance sometimes on boards where if there isn't consensus, it doesn't happen. So, you know, because if you've got somebody who doesn't on that panel, who doesn't want somebody in that team, are they also going to be a derailer? And I've seen that happen before as well. So I think the idea of an independent person can also act as somebody who can adjudicate between two people on the panel who may have differing views, and getting them to be able to see something that they may not have seen, or, you know, in the conversation. So I think, yeah, having that third person as an independent has got multifaceted benefits, not least of which would be the record keeping as well.
Thank you. Can you say in job advertisements only tangata whenua may apply?
Kirsty and Nikki.
I think it depends on the role and whether the role, the requirements of the role dictate that necessity. Would be my understanding, isn't it?
And I guess you'd have to be really clear around why that is a necessity, and if someone that
doesn't have it, if they can't do the job without it, then that has to be made pretty. Yeah, you have to be pretty upfront about that, I think.
You do. You have to be very careful about discrimination. So be really clear as to why you would be asking that, and how is it an absolute necessity.
Yeah, I've seen that done really well in job ads, for example, where they talk to the why. So they talk to who you're engaging with, and, you know, what the nature of the role is, and it very quickly makes it very clear as to the skills and experience and relationships and so on, without actually becoming discriminatory. So again, bring it back to what you're wanting to achieve, you know, from this person in the role, and who the stakeholders are and how that's going to play out.
Thank you. What do you think about doing an online interview if the position relies heavily on face-to-face relationship building skills, i.e. interviewers are in different regions, so the interview is online? Do you lose too much information, or you just need good interview skills?
I think we live our lives online these days. Like, it's so widely accepted that we have meetings over Zoom. I don't know why you wouldn't conduct an interview. In an ideal world, you would meet face to face, but I think, you know, in this candidate market, you know, if it's going to take you weeks to get somebody into your office to meet the relevant stakeholder face to face, then you're just running the risk of losing them. Again, a robust process with some really great reference checking should, I would say, would suffice.
Agreed. Thank you. How important is it that the panel members have some experience or expertise in the role or field of work?
I would say not actually that important. I think as long as they understand the role, if you think about recruiters have very rarely worked in the field that they hire in, but they do a really great job of taking a brief and then evaluating against that brief. And I think as long as the hiring manager, the panel member has done those things, then I don't think that they need to have had that in-field experience at all. I think somebody should, at least one of the panel members, ideally, but I don't think it's essential that all of them have.
And I suppose that's the role where an independent external could play a really valuable part if they're a subject matter expert in the particular field, but the hiring manager is not. Then that's a real value add that they can add on the panel.
We've heard this thing about panels come up multiple times today, and I think when we're selecting a panel, think about what the purpose of that person is on the panel. What value are they going to add? What do they need to add? And therefore, from that perspective, they are an expert at why they're on the panel. They're not necessarily, if it's skills you're talking about, let's just say engineering or something, then, maybe you need, and you're not an engineer, then you need to probably get somebody in to test that. But yeah, think about why that purpose is sitting on the panel. They're not just there to fill a seat.
Thank you. That's the end of the questions that are in the chat at the moment, unless anyone has anything else they'd like to ask. Looks like we're all good.
Kaela, have you got anything?
Sorry, I was on mute. No, nothing more to add from me. But look, thank you all so much for attending, and I will be in touch with everybody in due course with the slide deck from today.
Yeah, I'd just like to add too, thank you very much, Kaela, for putting this together for us, and also to Kirsty and Nikki from McLaren for giving us the opportunity to partner with you and providing some benefit to your clients and there as well. I know through experience that our clients have really valued Kaela's input when she's been engaged with them to assist them during the interview process, and it falls outside of the recruiter mandate, which is to source and pass on the candidates, and that's, you know, and to be able to do that part really, really well. So Kaela's been really great at doing that and bringing some tightness to the whole interview process.